everyone. This week's guest on Reintroducing the Art of Conversation is someone who radiates creativity and applies it to all comms, all her life. I'm a big fan, as you know, of Stefanie Preissner. I like to say we are mates from way back when. I never get to see enough of her, but she's married to a mailman now, so I feel like we're in a better space to talk continuously about all things GAA. But today's conversation is more about why she set up her famous podcast, basically, how and why she decided to tackle the gap that exists between the world of politics or the social realm out there, and realistic, just how to bring it to the to people in an easier fashion than what I'm doing right now in terms of talking about it. I get really nervous when I sit in front of Stefanie.
You're being mental. Like what? You don't. We're mates.
I know. It's just. I know. But it's just now. It's a little bit more, formal intro. And I want to give it as enough kudos and credit that you're always deserving. But for today's conversation, as I was saying, I'd love to really give a snapshot of Stefanie's work and chat about that disconnect and that gap that Stefanie places herself in the middle of. So the hard conversations, she creates and collates all the information and really brings it home to people. So with all that said, let me kick it off. You look fabulous, Stefanie.
Thanks.
Backdrop looks great. Thanks very much for joining us.
That's my sitting room. Over there is all my gym equipment on the floor. It's chaotic. But look, it looks fine for social media, and that's all we need.
You look fab. But can I ask you? Can I ask you just because I know you're super busy and you're about to hop off and do a million other things. But for my first question at the gap to you is, the knowledge gap is one that has haunted politics for centuries, and you and I have talked about this in the podcast. Basically, also is just how did it come to you? How did you say, right, this is a space that I need to take control of? Because otherwise, if I don't, it just continues.
So I didn't really think about it like that. That's sort of been the byproduct. But what I did, I noticed, so I love politics. I follow politics sort of like some people watch Love Island, all the players in it. And some people, when I was a kid, I often found it really boring. Like men in suits stand up in a very formal chamber and they speak in language that they put on these voices, unless you're a Healy Ray, like they kind of put on this act and they, address the nation. It just seemed like something I was separate from. And then I sort of got into it through my grandmother, and I realized, hang on a second, this is all just an act. This is all just an act, but what they're talking about is actually really important. And the only reason that they're talking is because we voted for them to be there. They don't have any power given to them any greater than what we give them. So I want to understand this. So then I started following it, and I started following it, and it was really quite basic what was happening, and crucial to, these conversations that happen in these chambers affect how much money I have in my bank account. And therefore, I should be following. And if I don't like that, I can vote and I have power to do that. But it suits the establishment. It suits the status quo that most people don't understand. So that those who should understand and want to keep the money in their pocket, and I'm talking about money, but like we also talk about healthcare, housing, education, all of these issues. If Joe blogs on the street, normal person who goes to Centra in the morning to buy the paper, get their lotto ticket and their Frank and Honest coffee, doesn't really understand what's happening up there, it suits that the people who do understand keep getting what they want, and it's a cycle, and that's really, really dangerous. So I was like, hang on a second, I'm just going to step in here, and if you want to know what's happening, I'm going to tell you what's happening in a really basic way. For example, just yesterday, I don't know when this is going to go out, but just yesterday, as in the 13th of October, I was getting a lot of messages on Instagram being like, I feel stupid to ask, but I know that it's safe to ask you, but what is a budget? Like, what is the budget that happens every year? And I was like, oh God, I'm really sorry. I just assumed I covered the budget on my Instagram, but I assumed that everyone knew what a budget was. And that's a really privileged and kind of disgusting assumption that I made. So I was like, backtrack a little bit, I'll explain what a budget is. And so I explained on Instagram very simply what a budget is, who Pascal Donoghue is, the Minister for Finance, who Michael McGrath is, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, what the difference between those guys is. I just do it in really basic terms. Like, Pascal Donoghue is in charge of your money, and Michael McGrath is in charge of the government's money. So Pascal is going to decide what happens to your money, how much tax you're going to pay, what you're going to pay tax on. And then Michael McGrath is going to spend the government's money, which is kind of your money because it's come in that way. But he's going to decide, okay, we're going to spend this much on roads, we're going to spend this much on education and health, and, you know, extrapolate that out. So I just find this, I just don't think that there's anything that is a stupid question, and that the hunt for knowledge or the want to understand is a really noble adventure and a really noble pursuit, and you should always be able to find out the information that you want. And I have a very deep understanding of politics and how things work, just not because I'm any bit more intelligent than anyone else, but I just follow it on a daily basis, in the same way that I could often ring my friends and be like, I have to go on air and talk about Love Island and have them watching it, who's who, what's what happens, like, is it Big Brother? And they explain to me, no, it's not Big Brother, it's this and this, and you're set challenges by the producers. There's nothing more noble in the fact that I understand politics than someone understands Love Island. It's just that we are interested in different things, we follow them in a very detailed way, and so that's why I give the information that I give, because I understand it, and people should understand it.
Yeah, and I have told you this before. I even said it on your podcast. Like, I have gone to your page in order to better understand at a national level what the hell is going on, because as someone new, relatively new into politics, as someone who has to read the dense pages of the Brussels speak, within the European Parliament, you know, there's times where I'm like, hang on, what is being said, and how is it being said? I'm a little bit lost here. So, and I'm not the only politician who does it.
No, you're not the only politician,
so,
and I can see.
But to your point,
but the politicians also shouldn't be like, yes, as a politician, it is your job to make sure that you understand what's going on. But as a politician, you know, you're an elected representative. It's not unusual that you would get into Dáil Éireann and be like, oh my God, so I saw an issue in my community, and so I ran for the Dáil. Now I am here. I don't know what is happening at all. Like, I've worked with female ministers, writing some speeches or just doing communications training, because that's what I do, and been like, you are one of less than 100 women who has ever stood up in this chamber and spoken. You know, that it's okay that you don't understand every minute detail. I follow it because it's a special interest of mine, and I can impart that knowledge. I don't think that it should be, you know, there was that time when Leo Varadkar went on the Late Late Show during COVID, and he pulled out of his pocket this sheet of paper, and people were like, oh, for God's sake, what are you, like, he's not a savant, like, he's not able to have a photographic memory, and he wants to give you the right information. You should never shame people for the tools that they use in order to understand something. I just can't relate to the impulse.
But to your podcast and to everything you just said there, and all the work that you do, you know, you really do, another fangirl, like, you really do make it a safe space. Like, I cannot stress enough how, as you say, there is no dumb question, that we're only going to get to the solution if we have an honest conversation, and with honest conversations come all the vulnerabilities of asking questions that come with, which segues me into my next question. This is what happens. I go on tangents, and then I forget about my format, and then we'll be so close to the end of the time, and I'll be like, I have 10 more questions. But what do you think is the main issue or issues with people with politicians not creating that space of conversations like you do on your platforms? And how do you think we should be making it more digestible? Is it exactly what you're just saying there, in terms of layman's terms, take out all the nonsense, noise, and just speak?
There's a disconnect.
Or is there other ways?
There's a disconnect. People don't. I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by the term, or turned off by the term politician. I think that it means once you get that title, you're in like negative equity morally. People are like, oh, you're just a politician, you're gonna scam me, you're just out for yourself. So there's that, first of all, preconceived notion, rather than like you're an elective representative. Once someone goes to the Dáil or to Europe, they sort of somehow start dressing differently, speaking differently, and they're no longer connected. Social media is doing great things. Like your social media, because you're young and you had a following first, you were connected to your audience first, so they're still following you. It's much more difficult for someone who's been in politics for generations to now connect back to people who are now voting. And it can be sometimes seen as like a little bit twee or a little bit awkward when they try to come onto the platform and be like, hey, look, I'm here and I represent you. But I do think that we're making strides in that direction. You know, we see Micheál Martin doing his Instagram lives, shirt open in his house. I think that's good and it's positive because he's trying to meet people where they're at. There's no way that we can unbake the cake. Like we can't. And I also think it's dangerous that, you know, that we would just completely separate the two, because politicians are the OG influencers. Like they are the original. They influence. They are the people who you should be listening to and following what's happening. To do it the other way around, to just say like an influencer who's a makeup artist, let's create her from scratch. She has 1 million followers. She's Irish and everyone looks at her page. She sort of has a responsibility to be telling people like, this is what's going on in the world. But if she doesn't know, then she's not going to do that. And so I'm trying to occupy that space of being like, okay, so I'm online and I have this following. And the thing that I'm trying to influence is your knowledge levels about what is happening in the world. And it's difficult because there are those platforms where people, you know, where politicians, sorry, to go back to your question and answer the question that you asked, I think there is a disconnect because one, politicians are so busy with the briefs that they have that they often don't have time to keep up with what's trending and what's online and what's the new platform. And then the people on the platform, just the general population of a country, the citizens of a country, don't want to be watching Oireachtas television because it's not cool and it can be quite boring and it's not given in there like the bite-sized nugget media that we need.
And our attention span has moved into.
That our attention span has moved into is not congruent with, you know, like a civil servant's speech about an issue that's happening in Carlow at the moment. And so it is about marrying those two together and getting elected representatives to be like, hey, I did this really long week of work, but here is a bite-sized chunk of what I did and what you need to know.
I love how you say with your Oireachtas television, like, I know you watch that.
Like, I love that. See, like, I love
that is your reality TV in some ways. Like that is your kryptonite.
I love it because it is like, and I have this one follower, I can't remember her name, but she has been following me since I started covering politics, and now she has done her Leaving Cert and she's studying politics in college because of my Instagram page. And I feel like a serious responsibility there where I'm like, oh God, I hope you don't hate it. But you know, I watch Oireachtas television and you can see like there are people like, so imagine it like reality TV. There are players, there are contestants in there, and they are contestants because they do have to compete to get their place again next time. And they hate each other. There are rivalries. They're like, oh, you're saying this because that is what's happening. But if I read between the lines, you're also giving a dig at this person. And I know you're going to circumvent that party and go to this person to undermine that. There's so much going on. And it's fascinating, the politics behind, you know, the economic and social policies that we have going on today.
Yeah. And the importance, to your point. Yeah. If we're, I mean, to your point.
So it's interesting to see it play out. To give a hard example, right? So Sinn Féin are an opposition party. It is actually their job in opposition. So are People Before Profit. It's their job in opposition to sort of like undermine the government or like poke holes in what the government are doing. And so it's going to be really interesting if the government ever changes, say Sinn Féin are ever in government or an opposition party. It's going to be fascinating to see, oh, well, you were all talk when you were on this side of the bench, but now you have to be answerable. So now what are you going to do? And I think if people understand how governments work, they will more clearly see, actually, this is just talk. This is just spin.
And this is the beef.
This is the heart. This is the meat and veg, and that this is what has to happen. And you know, it stops all of those like finger pointing nonsense conversations that actually don't get anything done or help in any way.
Yeah, and to your point, it also, I would hope, reduce, you know, the 144 characters of Twitter sometimes that goes on this tangent of only reading headlines and not the content. But that's easier said than done when I'm sitting in the very privileged position of being in politics. Can I ask you, in terms of basically,
Mm-hmm.
how has it
Basically
shaped?
being my podcast, just so
Yeah.
that in case people are
Yeah, can I ask you just about basically? How has it shaped your opinions on quite expansive subjects? So, has there been a moment where your own thinking has shifted and that you were challenged? I mean, to your point, actually, to your example around the budget, you know, thinking that everybody understood the budget or knew what the budget was, and that you literally just turned it going, oh, hang on, there's an opportunity to have a conversation here. Was there any of those other type of moments with the podcast, basically?
Yeah, so I just thought, you know, there's that saying, like, if you can't explain it in a sentence, you don't understand it enough. And I think people, that's actually not true. Like, there are subjects that take, like, the podcast is often 45 minutes long, and there are subjects that take that little bit of time to explain, but that doesn't mean that we're not always keeping it simple. Like, I always sort of have, like, I have a person in my head who she's 12 now. She's a relative of mine, distant, you know, relative of mine, and I'm thinking, like, could she understand this? That's not to say that the podcast oversimplifies things, but it does make things basic, because even the most complex issue, rocket science, let's say, even though actually rocket science is physics and we were putting people on the moon before we even had phones, so rocket science is actually pretty basic. But anyway, uh, like, even the most complex of things is built on blocks of basic understanding. So you have to sort of understand things basic on a basic way before you can go up. But at every point, it's like, are you still with me? Are you still with me?
Yeah.
And I am a good litmus test. So I think I represent just random Joe Soap quite well, because in the podcast, when I'm discussing complex things with people, where I lose my concentration is generally, or my understanding is generally, where the person listening has lost their understanding. And then I'm
Yeah.
able to ask the question that they were thinking. Well, that's what I'm hearing from feedback on the podcast. That, and I'm not afraid to ask. I don't know why this is, but I have no ego when it comes to my understanding of things. And I know that
Gorgeous way to be.
I've recently exposed that that I'm on the autistic spectrum and that I'm autistic. And I think it might be, there are some things, like very basic jokes, like knock knock jokes, that I don't understand. And I have to say, why is that funny? And then people explain it, and generally it's not really funny in the explanation. But I've always sort of felt like, I don't get that. And I will often turn to my husband when we're watching TV and be like, particularly in non-verbal scenes on television where people are just interacting with their facial expressions, I'll be like, why is she, what have I missed there? I know something has happened on this scene, but I don't understand. And he'll explain it to me. Or I'll be on TikTok and there's or reels, and there's, you know, there's a new trend of like, someone does this thing, and then everyone laughs. And I'm like, oh, I've missed it. So I think it's because I'm not afraid to say, I don't understand this. That, and other people, I think because of how we're schooled, how we're educated, they're afraid to say, actually, I missed that. Can you go back? Because they're afraid that the teacher will be like, oh, Mary, you're stupid and you're holding up the whole class, which I think some teachers have said to people, which is horrendous. But in school, I understood the education part. I never had to ask those questions, and I could see how other kids weren't. And I would often ask the question that other kids wouldn't ask, even though I knew the answer, but I would ask it for the sake of having it explained again, because I wasn't made to feel embarrassed about not understanding it. Because it was like, oh, well, if Stefanie doesn't understand it, then I have to assume that most of the class won't, because Stefanie is very, what's the word, academic, and understands a lot of things. And so I used to do that in school, and now I do it on the podcast. Even if I do understand, I'll ask the question, because sometimes people aren't great at explaining things, and I'll get them to say it in another way that makes it clearer. And then very often I just simply don't understand, and I'll ask the question. And I think it's, if you're courageous enough to ask the question, you can be damn sure that a lot of people needed the question to be asked. I even see it with the budget thing on my Instagram yesterday. people who are like, I'm 40 and I've never understood the budget as simply as you just put it, and I never thought to ask, you know. So asking questions is always leads to more knowledge, and more knowledge is always a good thing, I think.
Yeah, for sure. To say as your friend and an ultimate cheerleader of all things that you do, um, I think what you did, the bravery that you had in sharing that you are autistic, was phenomenal, Steph. Like it was phenomenal, because you lifted the weight, I believe, of what other people, to your point, either didn't know how to ask, didn't know who to ask, didn't understand why things were happening, and you broke it down in your article, on your social media, and no doubt in your podcast, basically too, that of who you are and where you're coming from, and even at your age, just how even having that knowledge just, well, I would hope just lifted weight off your shoulders. So I think bravery needs to be, everything needs to be celebrated, but in particular bravery on a public role that you just did.
Yeah, there's been sort of like 5 different strands of reactions, and I'll just go through 2 of them that I think are interesting. One is that people saying like, oh my God, I never thought that that's what autism was, and now I sort of understand it better, and thank you. And then another one, which is kind of like, I have been afraid of my child, like I have used your story to tell my child that they are also autistic, because I didn't know how to tell them, and they've had this diagnosis for a while. And those are just really, like, for that, all those reasons alone, it was worth it. Yes, it's a lot. It is a lot to be under that much public gaze and under public focus for that long, and that's never happened to me before, to be sort of in the whirlwind. I sort of underestimated it. I thought it was going to be like when I got married, and a lot of people said nice things who already knew me. I didn't kind of realize the reach that it was going to have. So it's been a little bit of a whirlwind, but it was worth it. And yeah, and also just to change the perception. Like, a lot of people follow me. A lot of people have followed me for a long time, through my article, through my podcast, my books, my TV show. And to be like, this person you've been looking at all the time and who you respect and think is great, I'm autistic, therefore, change your perception of autism. And it's great, because they're like, oh wow, that's what autism can look like too. It's not just Rain Man. It's not just a 7-year-old boy who can't make eye contact or respond to his mother who's rocking in the corner. And those perceptions I also had, and which is why I didn't get diagnosed for so long, because I was like, I couldn't possibly be autistic because I can make eye contact and I am empathetic, and yes, I struggle in all these other ways, and I have all these mental health issues, and I have this eating disorder, and I really struggle with change, but it couldn't be autism because I'm not Rain Man. But it is. So yeah, I know this conversation wasn't meant to be about autism, but
no, but this is about you and about sharing information and how you share it. So I'm really grateful that you allowed me to ask that question, and you allowed us to talk about it on this, because I think to your point, it's breaking down the barriers of that unconscious bias, that stigma that we either have or don't understand that we have. And I think that is a gorgeous gift, a very weighted gift. You and I talk about boundaries and mental health quite a bit too. And I just hope you're no doubt you're minding yourself, but just sending a lot of love from the west coast of Ireland. If you weren't feeling the love from County Mayo with the +1, I hope you're feeling it now.
Thank you so much. No, it has. There's been a lot of love.
Yeah. Well, come here. Final question, because I know you got to jump out the gap. We talk a lot about the changing conversation, and as you just did, sharing and sitting in your vulnerability and really embracing it. And under the guidance, and you mentioned it there in terms of mental health, like trying not to finish on so much of a heavy topic, but I think this is a serious conversation that, again, you and I have spoken about before. My beliefs around mental health, the fact that I think we should be moving into better models, like a mental health strategy, like the way Australia has upped their game in 20 free talk therapy hours for adults, the way Finland has brought in education around vulnerability for younger people, and then being in a preventative space around mental health and well-being, not just the reactive space that we often get. Can I ask you what you think is holding us back from where we need to be? And ultimately, under this conversation, what is it and how is it that we need to do? And this is a policymaker and those watching, that we need to kind of break those boundaries, the barriers down of having honest conversations around mental health and well-being.
Well, like,
I just threw a lot at you there, so sorry.
But in like, let's be rational and logical about it, right? The only reason we are ever not doing what we should, like, what we're not at the place that we need to be with, from mental health to electric vehicles, is because the decision makers and the policy makers don't see it as a voting issue, right? So when something becomes a voting issue, as in you will stop voting for people, that's what a voting issue means. So and maybe it's because people, so when something becomes a voting issue, something will be done about it, you know, when it becomes the priority. And that is a lot to ask, because typically, and I don't mean to, you know, I'm not tarring everyone with the same brush, but you have to be sort of like broad when you're having these discussions. Typically, people who have severe mental health issues, maybe they don't have the energy to become a lobby group, you know, like farmers have teachers, right? Teachers have a huge union. They're a very strong voice. They're united. They have this, like, we need maybe mental health, but it's a lot to ask. Like, why do the victims, let's say, of this inadequacy have to be the ones to have the magnanimity to become the lobby group to make it a voting issue? Or the other way that it can happen is that the decision makers, the people at the top, understand in a lived, serious way the implications of mental health issues. So either we need to get people with mental health issues elected so that they are the decision makers, they prioritize it, or that the people who are already in there, for some, like, you wouldn't wish it on anyone, but that they themselves have an experience of it, or someone in their family has an experience of it. But those are really the only two ways. Like, it has to become a priority. And that's a really hard ask in the mental health sphere, because generally people with mental health issues, like, the best prescription is prioritize yourself, mind yourself, don't put too much stress. And so becoming a lobbyist group, and the energy and effort it takes to protest and knock on doors and make something an issue, like farmers drove tractors to Dublin City to protest, teachers unions have gone on strike, like, it takes a lot of energy and effort, and often it's more than the people who have the issues can stomach, or can match that need. And so either we need allies who have that energy, or we need those people to get into government, and make it a serious priority for government. That's sort of a depressing answer. It's not very inspiring. It's just logical. That's how it works. Like, it needs to become a voting issue, and it needs to become a priority for government. And it's sort of like the loudest voice gets, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. The loudest lobbyist groups, the biggest unions, the teachers, the nurses, the farmers. That's why we have these departments, you know.
And just to cherry pick some of the, I wholeheartedly agree with you, wholeheartedly. And we talked about over the 2019 EU campaign. For me, you know, it was all people. It wasn't just some people, but it was all people talking about mental health when I was knocking on doors. But yet, when you get to the European Union, it's like, oh, why isn't all people talking about this? Because this is a fundamental big issue at home. But to your point, we need to have the connectivity of individuals, either in the policy arena or lobbying, but finding ways to bridge that, I think, is
and also, I think,
where we are now.
About things joined up, like, there is a department, like, so there is a minister for mental health. She's the minister for mental health and older people. Mary Butler is her name. She's a Fianna Fáil minister, junior minister in health. But there isn't a single department really that doesn't impact people's mental health, and there doesn't seem to be much joined up thinking. Like, she's given money to, like, tackle mental health on her own, but, like, we've seen during the pandemic that everything affects our mental health. So, like, if the cost of living is increasing and you can't pay your bills, that's going to affect it. If you can't access childcare, if you can't access a special needs assistant for your child, if the school you have to go to because you have to live, like if you have to live here and commute to here, your commute for 2 hours every day, that's going to affect it.
Yeah.
So, you know, and that is an argument that government do use, where they try to like increase people's general experience of the world. And I think it's about sort of separating like what is sort of just a positive. I was just a little bit disturbed by how the hair salons and the pubs opening became a discourse around mental health. Like, I need to get my hair done for my mental health. Okay, so self-esteem and mental health are not the same thing. Like, you might need to get your hair done for your self-esteem because you feel better, you look better. But like, when we're talking about anxiety, depression, eating disorders, other mental health issues, we've become very broad about mental health. And I think we need to be like, hang on a second now. We all have mental health. That is a spectrum. And sometimes our mental health can go down. But people who spend a disproportionate amount of time on the lower end of that spectrum really, really struggling. And it's not just a day here and then they bounce back to good, or, you know, when a series on Netflix ends, they're here for a while, or their sports team loses, they're here for a while, but they bounce back. We need to just be very specific that there are people who are disproportionately impacted by poor mental health, suicidality, like very severe, and that we can't say like, oh yeah, I know their lived experience because I also swing down there a couple of times a year.
Yeah. And actually that's a good nugget for a thought bubble for me, and not because I talk about it in a very general way to put it on conversation tables. But you're right in the sense of you have to be specific in order to protect those most vulnerable within the space. While also having the broader conversations that we have it, and to your point, finding allies and activists to support those that are in that,
and because
that
you
most
see
vulnerable
those
space.
those that swing on the spectrum, those people, we can prevent them. You know, that's where like the preventative measures, we can stop. I'm not saying that you don't swing down there, but I'm saying that like through things like self-care, knowing about yourself, taking a break, having boundaries, all those things, we can stop you. But boundaries and self-care are sort of like tic tacs to the people who live down here who really, really need support. And that's, you know, and so many things affect our mental health. That's why I'm saying that all the departments, like, you know, laws around gambling, laws around bullying, laws around social media, what you can say, sharing images of people, all that kind of stuff, they all have an impact. So there needs to be, I hate this phrase, I need to find a synonym, but some sort of joined up thinking, like just some sort of more holistic approach to mental health.
Absolutely agree. And I hear you on, we think in small bite size of whatever's in front of us. So I know Simon Harris, our Minister for Higher Education, rolled out in the budget mental health funding for higher level. But does that cover all third level institutions? That I need to find out. When you look at education, to your point, when you look at transport, everything has to have a common thread right throughout it. And if it doesn't, then we end up with huge pockets of our communities just left in limbo. I hear you on that point, without joint up thinking.
Moving, we sort of need like the two things to come together: awareness and acceptance. So like there's a lot of awareness now. We talk about it a lot, but there's still we're not really there with acceptance. Like it'll be great to say like, oh, everyone gets 20 hours. How many people would actually take that up? Because there's an awareness, but is there an acceptance of like, oh, actually, I need to talk to someone, you know? And that's everyone's doing it, and it's totally fine, and it will help. I think there's still, while awareness is huge, I think there's still a little bit of stigma there of like
absolutely
personalized, internalized stigma of like, oh, I don't need it. Like it's poor people with their mental health, but that's not me, so I'm fine, you know.
For sure. Absolutely. With that, I know we're really, really tight on time, and I'm cutting into your other work. Last question. What's new? What's coming out in your neck of the woods? Basically, podcast is flying. You're writing every week. Anything else that we should know about? Where to find you? If you're not following her on social media, I think you're one of two people in the country. But
follow me on. You can follow me on Instagram at Stefanie Preissner. You can follow me on Twitter at Steph Preissner. I very rarely tweet though because I'm just afraid. There's always just like gnarly responses from weirdos. So Instagram is where it's at, and I do answer my DMs. They're a bit overwhelmed at the moment, but I will get to you. And also basically is my podcast. You can find it wherever you get podcasts, and you can email if you want me to cover a topic. That's what I do with the podcast. So if I get enough people, so like we have world religions at the moment, but we're also doing a fertility series. So we're doing one this week about egg donation and sperm donation. I'm recording them tomorrow, so they'll be out. You can just send a request to basically@headstuff.org. But anyway, come and follow me and we can chat. And that's when I'll let you know when other things are coming out.
Winner, thank you. And thank you very much for gifting us time. Thank you for all you do in connecting those huge topics for everybody. So thank you, and thank you for sitting in your bravery and allowing us to be a part of your journey of research. With that,
it's my pleasure.
Love from the west of Ireland.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.